Okie doke. The vector component to Photoshop is very different from the rest of it. It's really kind of a foreign part of the program that's built into it. Does everybody understand, though, the difference between vector and bitmap? If you don't, I need to know. Everybody understands? Okay. Well, this is the vector component. So, to start with, one of the ways of building selections that we've used so far have been these basic tools here for rectangular marquees, and the lasso tool, and the quick selection tool, and the magic wand, and that's how we've made our selections. There's a different way. We also, before I move on, there's also the quick mask. We painted in the selection and then it turned into a selection. Okay. Well, this is another one where we can use something called a pen tool. Pen tool is down here. See the little pen nib? And you'll notice that there's a group of tools. There's 3 of them here. That are actually 4 of them, sorry, that are grouped together down here. There's the pen tool and its components. There is a type tool, which we've already used. Why this isn't directly underneath the pen tool, I do not know. This is the path selection tool. Because every time you use the pen tool, or you make selections, or you make shapes, or whatever, the vector component, it turns them into, they are separate objects. In order to move those objects, you need to use this tool here, which is selection tool. If you want to edit anchor points, which we'll talk about shortly, then you would use the direct selection tool. So why it's down here, I don't know. And then these are we have an ellipse tool, we have basic shapes. So if you're going to create some basic shapes, rather than just a simple path, we would use these. And again, they can be basic, they can just be paths that we can turn into selections, or they can be shape layers. And this is the part that I'll cover Wednesday. Today, I just want to focus on the pen tool. How would you make a selection using the pen tool? Okay, so it might be easiest if I just start with a brand new file. And in doing so, show you how to use the pen tool. Okay. What would be useful when you have the pen tool selected is make sure that you have paths selected here, have the panel available. Because when you use the pen tool, it is, those objects are placed on a separate, it's almost like a layers panel, but it's separate. Okay. The next thing we have to decide when we're using the pen tool at the top here is what is it exactly are we creating? Are we making a shape layer? Or are we simply making a path? And then when we get to other options later on, we'll be able to simply fill that shape with pixels. This is sort of a waste right here, the third one. And in here, mirrored what we see down here, some of the basic shapes that you can create. We also see add to path features over here. And we don't need any of those right now. It's really kind of unnecessary. Just plain old shapes are just fine. So I'm going to make sure that instead of shape layers, I select shapes, or rather paths. Now I select the pen tool. Because vectors are when you use vectors, you're basically drawing with mathematics is what you're doing. These are defined by mathematics, the shapes that you create. And every time you create a shape, or a path, or a line, or a stroke, or whatever you want to call them, they're all independent of one another. They're all separate. It's not like what we've used so far that you're working with pixels and they intertwine. And when you erase, you're erasing pixels, or when you paint, you're painting pixels. This is different. These are shapes that have been defined by mathematics. So if you can think of it in that way, and this is sort of basic geometry, that if you want to make a straight line, okay, a straight line in geometry is the shortest distance between 2 points, correct? So that's all we have to do is create 2 points. And when we do so, these are called anchor points. So to make a path, I simply click and I move the mouse and I click. And you'll notice that there is a line that now draws the two together. What I can do with this is I can turn this into a selection. I can stroke the path with one of my brushes, so it could actually look like it was painted with any one of the brushes that I have, which can be pretty cool. But as I said, in this particular exercise, what we're going to do is make a selection from it. Now you'll notice the last point that I selected is highlighted. It's dark versus the first one that is white. Okay? If I decide that I'm done with this line, what I have to do is hold down the Command key and then click outside, and that deselects it. So that this is a separate shape, and now I'm ready to make another path. So now I can click again, and I click, and I move the mouse. And if I want it to be perfectly horizontal, perfectly vertical, or at a 45-degree angle, what key do you think I'd hold down? Shift key. That constrains proportions or in direction. And there we go. If I want to deselect it, you can also select, rather than hit Command and then click, you can hit the selection tool and click, and it deselects. Now you'll notice in the path panel, I have two paths, but they're part of the same path, meaning it treats it as one element here. If I wanted these to be a separate, I'd have to delete this, and I'd come up here and I would select Save Path. And I could name it, and I'll just name it Crooked Path or something like that. And now I'm ready to create a new one. So then I can deselect it and I can recall it whenever I want. Now with it deselected, when I select the pen tool, and I click and I hold down the Shift key and I click again, now I have a separate one. And notice that when you create it, it's called a working path. What that means, sorry, is that if I do not save the path and I close my file and I reopen it, it will be gone. Okay, so if you do plan on reusing these, you have to save them. And again, to save them, you click here and the little flyout menu opens, select Save, and we'll call it Diagonal Path. Yeah.
What's the reason for naming this?
Because you might have a bunch of them, just like naming layers, and you're not going to know which one is which. You sort of know, but at a moment's glance, you'll know which one is which. That's the crooked one. It's not perfectly horizontal, and that's the diagonal one. And again, by clicking in this outer area, you deselect both, but you can recall them whenever you want. And this panel looks pretty similar to most, that if I select this, I can delete these two just by clicking here and clicking the trash can. Each of these have a different function down here that we'll get to in a little bit. Okay. So once again, now to make a zigzag line, it's similar to making a straight line. I click and I move the mouse and I click and I move the mouse and I click and I move the mouse and I click, and you just repeat that. Okay? That's all there is to it. Now, if I want this to be a closed path, then I have to do something slightly different. This is still an open path. So, for example, if I were to save this, let's save the path, I won't name it, just saving it. With this path selected, you'll notice I have some options down here. I can fill path with foreground color, and notice what it does. It fills it with black, but what it does is because it was not a closed path, it takes the end point and it joins it with the start point. I can also make a selection, or sorry, stroke the path, and when you stroke it, what it does is it takes the last brush that you used and it will stroke it with that brush. So I happen to have a 16 pixel brush, opacity 100, flow 100, And with that selected, and I select this one, notice what it does. It strokes it. Now this could be pretty cool because when we get to more complex shapes or paths, you can make your, write your name. And then we could control the brush so it doesn't have an infinite amount of paint in it, that it actually tapers off when you're done. So it looks like you're spraying or you're painting and it runs out of paint and it ends. It can be pretty cool. What you can also do with this too is that with this path selected, we can load a path selection from this. So now we have made a selection from it, and that's really the goal that we have today, to make a very complex selection based on paths. Now the last one that we can do here is that you can work the other way around. I can make a working path from a selection. So if you started with a selection and you want to quickly turn it into a path, you can do that as well. Also with this selection created from the path, just like we could before, we could go to select and we could say save selection, and we can name this. Looks like mountains or something, so mountains. So now I deselect the path, deselect, and again I can either recall this and I can move it about by using the selection tool to move it. Now I could create it up, but now watch what happens when I deselect it and I say load selection. It's where the last selection was. It's up here. So it always remembers the last place that it was saved. Okay, a little bit more complicated. So now we made a simple zigzag, and you know how to constrain directions. You hold down the Shift key. What if we wanted to make a little sine wave, a little smooth curve? Okay, now it gets a little bit more complicated. Now we select the pen tool, and I think the best way to think of this is imagine yourself on a road, and you're driving on a road, and you see the little amber signs to the side that tell you what the road is like ahead. It'll say that it's slippery when wet. It'll tell you that there's a sharp curve ahead, or it's bumpy or whatever. Well, typically, you would have a photograph underneath that we were tracing. So that's your, what path it's going to be. But now what we can do is if I know it's going to be curving, I can click and drag and I pull out what are called tangent handles. There's no path yet. These are just tangent handles that allow me to control the direction of the path. Now I can move to the next point because now we're going to change direction again, and I click and it already starts to curve, and as I pull on it, notice that it changes the direction of the path. It remains nice and curved, but it curves down, and now when I click again, because these tangent handles determine the direction that the path is taking or will take. So now when I click again, even before I've pulled on it, notice that it wants to pull that path down to the right of it. Now when I pull up, I have my path here. And again, I can go ahead and I can fill it, stroke it, create a selection from it, do whatever I want. Okay? And one thing you have to remember too, that if you decide, okay, I'm done with this, and you don't deselect it, as soon as I click down here, notice that it wants to connect. So you have to remember to either hold down the Command key and click to deselect it, and then we can create another one. Okay? Okay, so let's make it a little bit more complicated. So we've made curved shapes. Now we're going to go from straight to curved and from curved back to straight. And that's where it gets really tricky. It's kind of like patting your head and rubbing your stomach at the same time. There's some key commands along with using the pen tool. So if I want to start by going straight, I just click, hold down the Shift key, and click, and it's straight. But now what if I want the next part of this to be really curved, but I want to leave this part alone? Does that make sense? I want this part to be a nice big curve, but I don't want it to affect this. So now what I do is I hold down the Option key, and I click and I drag, and when I do, I pull out not a path, but I pull out a tangent handle. So that's the Option key. Now I click and I drag, and I've made it nice and curvy. But now I want to go back to a straight line. And if I just click here, notice that that tangent handle wants to pull it down in that direction. So instead, now I do something that's similar, but it's slightly different. To get rid of this extra tangent handle down here, I hold down the Option key, and I click on that anchor point, and it removes it. So now I can hold down the Shift key, and I can click over here. So this is much harder, and this is a better example of what you're going to do here. Now there are other variations of this, and probably be better if I did the demonstration that we do in Illustrator. But it's close, but not quite the same. When you're done with your path, you can always add anchor points. That's what these are. You can remove anchor points. And you can also always change the direction of the anchor points. And those tools are found underneath the pen tool. There's the free form pen tool, which I think is totally worthless. We can add an anchor point using this tool. So if I want to add an anchor point up here, I just click on the path and it adds one. Similarly, if I want to remove that point, I use the delete anchor point tool, and I click here and it removes it. Now watch what happens when I remove this one though. See how it dramatically changes the direction of the path? Because again, the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. So I've eliminated that geometry, and now it wants to straighten everything out. So that's something that you need to contend with when you do that. And I also mentioned that there's also the convert direction tool. So if I want to turn this from a corner point into a curve point, I click, and it doesn't remove the point, but it makes it a corner point, which is what these are. Similarly, if I use this tool and I click and I drag on it, notice what I'm doing here. It pulls that back out, but unfortunately, it affects that. So I can click here, and then that corrects it by holding down the Option key and clicking. Have I thoroughly confused everybody? Maybe if I were to go to the flying saucer now, and they have a template for us that shows us where we're supposed to start. This is similar to one of the connect the dot drawings that you see at Denny's or any family food restaurant where they have kids menus, you know, when they give the kid a little paper placemat, and then they hand them some crayons and some crackers and stuff to keep them quiet, satisfied while the food is coming. That's what this is, and they give us directions how to do this. So I'm going to go ahead and zoom in, and I will try my best to explain to you what I'm doing as I'm doing it. And for me, would I start here at the top? Probably not. I'd probably start over here or maybe here, probably at the end or at the beginning. Why? I don't know. That's just my preference from experience. And when you do create a path that goes around a shape, you have to go either clockwise or counterclockwise, and you can't go back and forth. You just have to go in sequential order all the way around the shape. And when you reach the end, you will see, and I'll point out to you that when you move the mouse on top of that point where you started, there will be a little icon in the lower right-hand corner with a circle that lets you know that you are now closing the path. All the paths that I've used so far have been open-ended. So, let's use the pen tool. And similar to what I said before, I know that this is going to be curved. So I click and I drag to pull out the tangent handle. They've been quite generous for us, and they've let us know how far to pull it out. When you're doing this, you don't know, only through experience. There are some handy suggestions that typically you pull it out no farther than the curve is going to go, but it's guesswork until you've done this enough that it's You either typically do it too much or not enough, but I wouldn't worry about it because you can always go back afterwards with the direct selection tool, which is the white arrow tool, and you can edit them, which is what I will do. Now I go to point B, and it tells me to click and drag. Now if I pull to where they're pulling it, notice that mine doesn't quite fit. But that's okay. What I would rather do, and I would rather that you do, is look at the path underneath, and that's what I want you to follow. And then I can release the mouse. So I want to make sure that my path is following that white line pretty closely. Now I'm ready to go to point C. But as I said, I pulled on that tangent handle. And that means if I go to point C, it wants to curve that. I don't want it curved. So I'm going to undo. I'm going to hold down the Option key. And I'm going to click on the anchor point, and it removes that tangent handle. Now I can move to point C. Now I can move to point D and click and drag to pull out a tangent handle a little bit. And I can move to point E, and I click and I drag because I want to complete the curve. And now I click on F. And just by clicking, because I didn't have a tangent handle before, I don't have one now. So now I can hold down the space bar, move over, and now I can go to point G and click and drag again. And the farther I pull, the more distorted. If I spin the tangent handle around, notice where the path goes. So you have to kind of just, this is sort of the Zen part of it. You pull until you sort of get it in the right place, and then you move it around just a little bit until it fits, or fits closely. And then you let go, and mine doesn't quite match theirs. That's okay, because I'm going to come back when I'm done, and I'm going to tweak the points afterwards, the anchor points and the tangent handles. Now I'm ready to continue to curve. So to continue it, you simply click on the next point, and then drag until it fits. I hypothetically could probably go all the way over to here and click and drag, but that's such a wide arc. It is probably the best to just go half the distance and add another anchor point. The trick is when you're going around a path with the pen tool and you're adding anchor points, is that you want to use as few anchor points as possible. You'll get a much smoother curve, much smoother shape when you do so. So once in a while I'll click again. Notice that it starts to curve, but as I pull before I release the mouse, and now I get it so that it's close, and I release and I'm in good shape. Now I go to the next point and it continues the curve, so I move the mouse on I and I click, and then I drag again, and then I pull and I push and I move back and forth until it fits the path, and then I move again to J and I click, and that's all I need to do is click. I don't need to drag because this now is in a sharp turn. Notice that this doesn't quite fit. That's okay. I'm going to come back with the direct selection tool and I'll tweak it. Zoom in a bit so I can get a better look. Click, drag to pull up the next tangent handle. Click and drag to continue it. And then I go to M, and because this is an abrupt change in direction, I simply click. Move again, click. I want it to curve in the next point, so I hold down the Option key, and I click and I drag to pull out the tangent handle. And now I'm on the last leg. I move to the end, and this is what I was talking to you about. This is the same place where I started. Okay, when I roll over it, do you see it's very subtle? To the right-hand side of the pen icon is a little circle. Does everybody see that? That indicates as soon as I click, it's a closed path. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off that template that they showed us, and actually I screwed up. No, I didn't. Let me go ahead and save the path. Save path. There we go. And, turn off, there we go. So here we have our path. We don't have that template anymore. And you won't have a template when you're doing your own. And now what I do is I just start all over again, sort of. I don't start with the pen tool though. I start with underneath the path selection tool. I use the direct selection tool because what this enables me to do is select individual anchor points and manipulate the anchor point and or the tangent handle separate from the path. So now I can click and I can move this anchor point around until it fits. I can take on the tangent handle and I can pull it back a little bit until it fits. I can click on the next point over here and then I can move the tangent handle just a little bit. See how I'm tweaking it just a little to make it fit nicely? Another thing that I'd recommend too is that I would make your path, try to make it about 1 or 2 pixels inside the shape so that when you turn this path into a selection and you wrench it from its background and move it over, you won't be capturing any of the pixels outside of it. So once again, I just point by point go around, check to make sure that everything that I have selected is working pretty nice. And I usually start by manipulating the anchor point a little bit first, then the tangent handle, anchor point, go inside just a little bit, then tangent handle. Check the next part, and that looks pretty good. This needs to come in just a little. Maybe pull the tangent handle out just a little bit until it fits. That's a good fit. Hold down the space bar and move around again. Pull this out just a little. Maybe this does need to be pulled down a little bit, so I need to go back and correct this. I'll pull this up a little bit. That looks pretty good. Maybe zoom out a little bit. Move this up so that it's inside the shape just a tad. Pull on the tangent handle a little bit, get it a closer fit. Use the space bar to move over. Again, start by moving the anchor point so that it's inside. Then move the tangent handles to tweak the path just a little bit. And remember how big this bulges out? Just click and pull it in, and it makes it fit pretty nicely. Okay, when I'm happy with it, and I've already have it saved, it's path 1. When I deselect it, I can always come back and I can re-edit it. You can always edit it, no problem. With it selected, I can now go ahead and I can select this middle button, can turn it into a selection. One thing you'll notice, see in here, I do not have these selected. This is all one big selection. While this is a selection, I can use, again, any combination of marquee tools. So it might be better that I select the magic wand, hold down the Option key, which will allow me to subtract, and I click in that little area, and that's subtracted. Hold down the Option key, click in that area, and that's subtracted from the selection now. Now I can go in and save the selection. The reason the pen tool is such a good tool for making selections is that it's continually editable, and it is good for shapes like this that are geometric, that are really hard edge shapes, not soft shapes, but really hard edge ones. Now I can go to the select tool or select menu, save selection, and we'll name it saucer. Select, I've got it saved. Now if I want to join this with another, and this is what we'll be doing, with another file, use the move tool, just simply click and drag it over, and voila, you've got your selection. You've made your selection and isolated it. Okay? If you have trouble with this tool in the next week or so, let me know. And what I will do is I will open the Illustrator exercise and we'll go over that and maybe give you that so that you can play with it. It is a useful tool. You will not be using it a lot, but it's still very helpful, very useful. And on Wednesday, what I want to do is then go back now and cover shapes in this particular file. Because you'll notice that they have some guides for the star, and they have that boomerang shape, and it's similar to what we've done over here with the spaceship or the saucer. To make the little boomerang shape, they tell us where to click and drag and release. It's not, the directions aren't that good. It's not that clearly defined as that how you actually do this. Okay? Any questions about what I've covered so far today? Sort of. Not until you actually do it. If you do know it, it will really be very helpful. No question about it. If you don't know it, because it is so foreign to Photoshop, because it's like a program in a program, it's Illustrator inside Photoshop, you'll probably tend to not use it because it is so different. If you already had Illustrator or you're taking Illustrator, then you won't have any fear and you'll just use it all the time. Again, especially for shapes like this, it is a good example. Okay, so if there aren't any questions for this, the remainder of today is, yeah, okay.
How did you keep it from blowing the color?
Oh, so it wasn't, the color wasn't filled? When you select the pen tool, you have options here. Now watch, if I were to select the shape, this one, it makes a shape layer. And so when you look at the layers panel, see if I click here like so and close it, I look here and there's a shape layer. And it behaves in many respects like type. It's independent of everything else. So make sure that you select just paths for this, and then we turn the path into a selection. On Wednesday, we will use the shape layer, and we will use some of these add and delete functions, which are really pretty cool, that allow you to make movable masks, basically. But again, sometimes, from my point of view, the illustration that they have is kind of hokey. It's not one I would do. And if I were doing something along these lines, I would probably do it in Illustrator, and then I'd drag the Photoshop piece over to that rather than do it this way. But if you only have one program, and I don't know if I said this the first day of class, if you can only afford one computer graphic program, Photoshop would be it. That would be my choice, hands down. I use Photoshop more than anything. But if you do choose to do other things, if you want to go into web design, if you want to go into 3D modeling, if you want to go into desktop publishing, doesn't matter. You still have to use Photoshop for all of those. In 3D modeling, if you're going to build 2D surfaces, projection maps, Photoshop is a good program to use. If you're in web design, you still have to prepare all of your images for the web. Photoshop is the program you're going to use. If you're going to design brochures or product guides or anything like that, and you're using InDesign, still have to use Photoshop to prepare all of your images that will eventually go in InDesign. But Photoshop is just an all-around great program. It is the program I think is the most important. So that's my 2 cents. Okay? Okay, sure.